International Jazz Day was conceptualized out of a need to revive the popularity of jazz to its audiences and in contemporary times, I guess. The people that conceptualized it sat down, they realized that jazz has lost a lot of audiences over the years and relevance. So they wanted to make it relevant. While that was happening, places such as Smithsonian, the museum itself, they had at some point over 10 years back realized that there had a lot of material in the archives that was related to jazz art. Around the time of April, they would periodically go into the vault and take out artworks that were painted during a particular jazz era. And then they would start talking about the background of these artworks and, you know, associate them with jazz. And they would also celebrate the moments when those artworks were made by having live performances and discussions about the times and eras they were celebrating. So when the Thelonious Monk Institute, which has now been renamed the Herbie Hancock Institute for Jazz in the past few days, they then decided that because there's a project called Jazz Appreciation Month, which was started by the time Smithsonian would visit its vaults, they then said maybe because we have a whole month of jazz, you know, celebrating different ways, can't we dedicate the last day of jazz to become an International Jazz Day, which means the last day of that April month? Because they recognize jazz as music of universal appeal and messaging. They then went to United Nations Education, Science and Culture Organization of the United Nations, which is UNESCO. And they put their idea through to say, we need the world to come together again in the name of jazz. And that's how UNESCO then joined forces in naming 30th of April International Jazz Day. In 2011, all of this happened. And when they did that, they invited Herbie Hancock to be their worldwide ambassador for jazz for this project. Herbie Hancock looked at the list of luminaries that surrounded him, that were his friends and colleagues in jazz, and he nominated 200 of them to be jazz ambassadors. Amongst them would be your known names, whether it's Didi Bridgewater, you know, Hugh Masekela was an outstanding member of this. In fact, when they launched it on Congo Square in New Orleans, in the United States, because that is where the story of jazz begins, you know, with obviously the story of the slaves coming on and bringing a new sound into the environment, you know, because slaves were coming from different parts of the world and being sold off there. And so it was a center of, or a melting pot. You know, I'm not even sure to use the word melting pot around the stories of slavery. So 2011, then this project gets launched, and there's a call to the rest of the world fraternity of jazz to recognize this day. And the call happens by way of saying, can anybody who loves jazz on that day commemorate jazz in one way or another? So whether I'm reading a book about jazz, I'm contributing to celebrating it, whether I'm sharing it with friends at a book club, or whether I'm sharing music or giving a gift of music, or attending a concert, or putting together a concert if I'm a promoter. Everybody joined in. UNESCO by nature is an institution, it's an intellectual institution. So there's also the educational side of jazz, which is part of the package, and the cultural side of it. So then jazz starts to recognize cultures of the world, starts to recognize academics and academic institutions who play a part in jazz, you know. And when we heard about this, obviously the whole jazz fraternity was excited. There's a day in which all jazz lovers are going to just sit back and enjoy this music in many ways that they can, but also watch a unique concert that is hosted by a country, you know, in their own celebration. Obviously, you know, I was saying, you know, when I talk about it, that isn't it interesting? This is a global movement that was launched on a website. Literally, the website spread the message. In no time, all 165 countries that are UNESCO members were all participants in this campaign. So then, obviously, they started the process of having countries bid to host. Turkey, being a very exciting jazz destination in Istanbul, then said they'd like to host the next one. followed by Japan, followed by France. For us, the wake-up call came in 2015 when we had the xenophobic attacks. It was a shocking thing for all South Africans, and we realized that as people in jazz, what other way can we contribute to the dilemma of xenophobia using jazz? Then we officiated a jazz movement. We started International Jazz Day South Africa. We called in musicians, artists. The city of Joburg hosted us. The Market Theatre hosted us. Writers, journalists. We called in over 100 people to sit in the same room and say, we have this dilemma. Africa needs to talk to itself. There's an opportunity of International Jazz Day for us to talk about messages that have to do with unity, and humanity using jazz. And it was incredible how the response came about, because then the group that was sitting with us said it's important for South Africa to have an International Jazz Day chapter, because South Africa has not maximized its potential as a jazz destination. And number two, this problem that we're highlighting of xenophobia is also a communication that Africa needs to integrate so that we understand one another. Here's music that says that we are one. And here we are saying we're not one. The third one was the rise of jazz in our townships, in our jazz clubs, in our schools, people choosing to study jazz, and that there's a product that is coming out that is exciting. So joining this movement would allow us a lot of opportunities to promote ourselves, to promote what the music is doing, the musicians, the practitioners, and to also join the world on a conversation that the world is having around jazz. And that's how we started International Jazz Day South Africa. We then called a number of organizations to say, can you come and join us? And the first people to respond was the Savmor Foundation, because they had been dealing with jazz education or music education. The foundation spends a lot of time doing that. Andre Leroux and his team. I mean, if you notice that there's a scholarship for outstanding instrumentalists or vocals, or, those competitions happen all the time, and they happen through academic institutions, whether UNISA scholarship and so on. Then they came and joined. And one of the biggest supporters of music education or art education is Bongle Kumar. She came very vehemently on board and spoke about that. Samro spoke about how they touch the rest of the world in terms of cultural exchange, in terms of just tour ventures where musicians go and stay and take a residency somewhere in Europe and they come out with an album. So we realized that we are part of a global movement, but we haven't consolidated ourselves like that. And of course, there came calls from journalists who said, South Africa has one of the most exciting jazz archives. If you go to the SABC, you'll find recordings from as far back as the 50s, if not earlier, which is about South Africa recordings of jazz that have never been brought out, that people don't know about. Some have passed on. Families don't even know this legacy exists. And it's, interestingly, it was just before the story broke that SABC had sold some of the archives. People were already saying there's an archive that is important that can be used for teaching heritage and for creating a national memory around music and jazz. And others were saying, music or jazz education is not just education in the schools. It's about how to understand the art called jazz or the medium called jazz. People that love jazz would tell you how they learn to listen, how they learn to listen to very complicated compositions and other things, because it's an art of listening that eventually makes you appreciate what the music format is about. And they were saying, so there's a way of listening to jazz. We need to be able to share amongst one another. There's a way of writing about a jazz record, which is a specialized area on its own. And journalists were saying it's important that people know the difference between an alto saxophone and a baritone, And people were saying, so when they listen to broadcasters, sometimes they find that people are just, they're not exchanging knowledge as deep as they should. So they said we need to also fight for that, for promoting understanding of jazz. And one of our founders is the chairman, Mutsumi Makreno, who's an ethnomusicologist, was talking about the history and heritage of jazz, where it comes from, how we shouldn't discard our own music in order to be a jazz community. Because if you look at countries that share a history with Africa, for instance, like Cuba, like Brazil, they're using their indigenous forms. That's why there's a particular beat and rhythm to the way they present jazz, you know. And that's one thing that Africans must also be able to engage, you know. He also further on said, and just like Abu Kaifa Sime, that there's jazz dance. You know, those well-dressed men and the moves that they do to the music, you know. There's that dance, and there's other forms of dance that use jazz. You know, then there's jazz art, you know, the art that is inspired by jazz. And you talk about people like Dumile Feni, who would never paint unless there's either a jazz musician in the room who is playing something or he's listening to a record, you know. So therefore, the whole conversation around jazz started expanding in that regard. And for us as an organization, when I convened and started this, I wanted us to get to that point where we all understand that there's work to be done and that jazz is an important medium. So I then went on to put together an organization called Spin Foundation. You know, I do have a productions company called Spin Productions, and then created a non-profit side of this organization and made this project one of its key projects, where we now focused on how do we really formalize a group of people that are interested in seeing Jazz Day come to South Africa. And we're joined by a number of people, musicians, journalists, photographers, artists, who said they think it's a good idea. But Spin itself had to raise funds to be able to do that. Raise funds to have have an office where every day we're running the business of bidding. Our first bid was rather shockingly pathetic. It was very big, broad ideas, you know. But we did our homework eventually. We understood that in South Africa we have an organization, we are a representative of UNESCO. In fact, we pay fees to UNESCO to belong. So we are rightfully in place to be able to bid as a host country. Then we started engaging. In South Africa, UNESCO belongs in the office of the Department of Basic Education. So we approached the minister, and they also have what is called the head of UNESCO, who is the commissioner of UNESCO in the country. We engaged with them, and we got opportunity for them to send us information. When the bid announces to say the bid is open, then they saw us as an organization, because they interviewed us to find out that we are well comprised. We are part of a society. We are not just a few individuals who are doing this. We represent the fraternity. And then they said, okay, we'll help you get what you want. We'll help you organize yourself. Get the information that we want. And that's how we started talking. And the Minister of Education was interesting to talk to, because she was saying that the biggest challenge about transforming education in South Africa is the whole history of what subjects inform the curriculum, what content informs the curriculum. And she was saying that part of her biggest challenge is to bring historical matters into the classroom so that young people understand their history. And cultural history is very important. And she saw jazz as that platform that can help teach the history of Princess Makoko, the history of the Brotherhood of Breath, the history of the songs that left the country and, grazing in the grass, during apartheid and so on, that it would be one of the best ways to teach. So the minister was definitely supportive of that. And then, of course, you then look at the fact that when you engage with the then Thelonious Monk Institute, and you engage with the ministries and their purpose, you then realize that you need to articulate the vision of the country in the document. So we pick up the phone, and I picked up the phone and I called the Monk Institute, and I found the lady who runs the institute, and I wrote an email to her. And I said, South Africa is very interested in this program. It means a lot for us at this transition where we are in terms of our democracy. And she said, we would be very excited if Africa hosted this, anyone in Africa. And she says, personally, they think South Africa has a whole lot of opportune occurrences, as a host country, and started supporting us. and not supporting us against other countries, but being able to recognize our effort. So it meant, therefore, that we had to get the nation talking about International Jazz Day and show that the nation is behind us. That was a very exciting part, to pick up the phone or to get the phone to announce to society that, here's how Jazz Day in South Africa can benefit all of us. So we had a big interview with her. And I must say, Kai FM came on board to allow for that to happen. It was when people were listening to a lady called Mika Shino, who gave us a long interview, 20 minutes long, articulated the importance of Jazz Day. That almost in a week or two's time, the phone calls started coming. Organizations started organizing Jazz Day. I mean, the Orbit annually does a big Jazz Day showcase over days. All different institutions and individuals started putting together Jazz Day events. Now, what happens when I say that this project was launched using social media, and technology to reach the world, is that when you open the page in International Jazz Day, you look at global participants, and they are listed according to countries and cities. So you open and look for South Africa, and you find that there's over 20 events. They don't register to us as Spin Foundation. They register directly to the Jazz Day, and they get a letter from Herbie Hancock congratulating them on joining the global movement. And that encouraged them because they understand that it's really true. It's not talk shop, that they are part of a big conversation. But what the Monk Institute and UNESCO felt it was important was the fact that jazz must be used as a tool for uniting nations. They are ready to go to war-torn areas. They are ready to deal with the issue of gender issues, social justice, all of that. And we said to them, for Africa to see itself as one, we'd like to use this platform, hence the whole challenge that we're facing around xenophobia. We then also said, we recognize this as a huge leverage, marketing leverage for brand South Africa, and so it therefore meant, if that's the case, who else is a stakeholder for us? So we went and knocked on the door of the Minister of Tourism. And it was at a good time because he turned around and said, for the past few years, we've been struggling to make tourists come to South Africa because we've always marketed ourselves around animals and wildlife. Now we realize that to sustain ourselves, we need to market this country around its culture. So you've come at the right time. So, things started aligning in that way. So we've designed a very exciting program, for instance, around, I always make an example, even when I talk to my colleagues in the library like you guys, that there's a project called the Nile Project. It's around the Nile River, and it shows the different communities of the Nile and the music, the different music language that they have, and how they put together an exciting project, which is artistic project and albums out of that. So we've got mountain ranges in Tabazo-Kahlamba. It's different communities that live at the edge of that. We've got South African Parks Board. When you go to Mapungubwe, there's a story that the vendors are telling about the drum and the rain. When you go, you know what I'm saying? That these are all things that contribute to the sound and the music. The jazz that comes from people that are influenced that way, for instance, from Limpopo, it's Bosilo Khalane, it's Botloko Sihume. You can hear the spiritual jazz. If you think about it, when you talk about jazz in the United States, for instance, jazz in Chicago is informed by the spiritual side of things. The musicianship is different, than jazz, which is hardcore. It's about your chops and competitive in New York, And we have the same environment. Cape Town is a different offering. It's got a lot of academic institutions. Most of musicians from Cape Town are literate. Musicians from a place like Johannesburg, which is characterized by urban living, by mobility of people from the rural into the urban. Musicians find their way in other ways, to establish themselves. And that gives a different products. And we're saying that it's an opportunity to showcase those destinations, for instance, with our partnership with the Parks Board. And be able to go in, take a picnic basket on Jazz Day and go and celebrate in a picnic and watch a big band or an array of school big bands perform one after the other. So those are the plans that we put in our big document, to show the country, the exciting sounds of it and all of that. We if we remember our history as well, we used culture as a tool to fight for our freedom. Amandla ensemble by Jonas Gwangwa and Steve Dyer in Botswana was an outfit that was traveling the world by jazz musicians talking about the plight of Africa. The musicians that left were all about using Malombo. One of his biggest assets within the movement for freedom was that Julian Bahula would convene such events to raise funds as well as cultural boycott calls for all those other things. And we thought jazz is also a gift to our freedom. Let's not forget that. So we look at the 27th of April, which is closer to the 30th of April, as an opportunity to highlight how jazz played a role. Because I think we believe that it's important for South Africa to recognize South Africa's history in totality. Not to hide South Africa's history because we're scared of telling certain truths. We're not making anybody atone, but we're all embracing the truth of what happened to move forward. And jazz is a tool through which you can do that. And one of the things that we also put in our proposal was a conversation that has to do with if the world is going to come to South Africa and 169 countries and their jazz chapters are coming here, what can we learn from them? The Americans are very strong on intellectual property and copyright laws. We are grappling with them here at home. Be it the works of photographers like Ernest Cole that have passed on, how we're handling their legacy, where's their work, what does the family own, what global treaties are we signing that is affecting the legacies of these families. Contested legacies has become a big conversation globally. We're joining that conversation on behalf of our own selves to look at our own policies and help us. We looked at all the institutions like in the country. Stellenbosch has got a huge jazz program. UCT has, UKZN has. But we then looked at the fact that we can't say we are doing an African bid when we don't involve the African continent. Morera runs Jazz Day in Mozambique. Him and I have been in great conversations. In fact, when we did the first bid, he sent his letter of saying, I pull back my bid, I go with the South African bid. Kenya has their own International Jazz Day. The biggest one that I've heard about, which Rashid was an advisor of, Lombard, is the Nigerian Jazz Day bid. Botswana, every year, they put out a tender for Jazz Day. And they put a budget and say, okay, we've put on 10 million pula. Anybody who's celebrating Jazz Day, can they bid for this fund? Those are our allies. So there was a time when we went to Paris to go and meet with the Africa, because every country that has an embassy in Paris has got a division that is in UNESCO. So when you put them in Paris, like our ambassador, they are also in UNESCO. And they all come together on Africa Week to talk about Africa convergence. And we went to them when they had their meeting and spoke to all of them and said, for us to bid for Jazz Day as Africa, can we allow each other the chance to bid? Let's not outbid one another. Let not Washington sit with bids from all 52 countries. So we asked them to give us a chance to bid for 2020, and they did. So it was very exciting to hear the news that we won the bid. I think because we showed that unity as well as a continent. We also had, obviously when you talk to SA Tourism or the Department of the Ministry of Tourism, SA Tourism kicks in because it's one of their organizations. And SA Tourism has got a chapter called the National, they assist bids, Convention Bureau. So when you do a bid, you collaborate with them and they'll talk about what they'll bring to the party. We realized that some of our cities don't have good reputation, like Johannesburg in terms of crime. Cape Town won because it's listed as one of the top 12 preferred destinations in the world to host cultural events. So it was easy to sell Cape Town as a host destination. Cape Town has an interesting history of jazz and slavery. In fact, there's some ships that used to come from Mozambique on their way to Brazil and Cuba and America. they used to come and refuel in Cape Town. And so that's why the Cape Malays found themselves in Cape Town. That's why the Dutch found themselves through Cape Town. You understand? So it was a slave port. And the music says that, because you hear Guma, you hear, all of that. So Cape Town became that. So while Cape Town is the host, the big questions in the bid was, how are you going to make this project impact nationally? So we have roadshows in different provinces, because there's different jazz chapters in each and every province. So the programming is going to involve that. So the first thing that we have put on the program, which is very exciting, is because we're starting to collect again. So jazz collectibles are huge, whether it's an album or a gramophone or an LP player, or somebody's saxophone that used to belong to somebody who is late or who is still alive but is selling it, and somebody wants to say, I own this instrument by Fair Fago. So we're having something like that. It's called the Africa Jazz Market. It's going to be for collectibles of any sort, from pictures to fashion to, so it's going to be something that will keep everybody occupied. We then have a big exhibition. In fact, we're partnering with the Smithsonian Museum to show how jazz traveled through the sea, and what artifacts exist that show that the slaves did not just bring themselves, they brought their music, they brought their culture. So we're having a huge exhibition at the National Gallery in Cape Town. We also have a big concert. The Global Day concert is going to happen at the fort that was built by the Dutch. They built this huge castle, which is where they kept the slaves before they would put them away, and other places like that. It's lovely. It gives us a chance to host something, that of significance on a significant site. And we've identified what that is. Then we have jazz promotions with jazz societies and jazz clubs. The listening sessions, the listening guides. We have picnic sessions that are going to happen as a build-up. And we also have clinics. These musicians, when they arrive, all these 200 ambassadors, when they arrive, they spend over 2 weeks in the country, traveling, visiting jazz schools, jazz community colleges, doing workshops and doing jam sessions with them. So that's part of the program. And then we have a discussion on music and education hosted by UNISA, which will be all the educators who then talk about syllabi and how to teach. But most importantly, it's just from the 1st of April 2020 until the 30th of April 2020, having crazy jam sessions in all over the country happening through to celebrate, and creating all those build-ups. And of course, welcoming musicians from all over the world who will be here.